How does a boy, born into humble beginnings, become Europe's most flamboyant and controversial politician? Silvio Berlusconi is the Italian version of Donald Trump. An extraordinary journey from being a failed musician to becoming a media tycoon and Italy's president on 3 different occasions. However, I must warn you, there are many sides to Silvio Berlusconi. On the one hand, he was an amazing businessman. Some would even call him the best salesman alive. He used his charisma to make multi-million-dollar deals, from building a real estate empire to owning nearly all of Italy's commercial television channels. Yet, on the other hand, he was rumored to be in bed with the Sicilian mafia, who allegedly paid for his real estate enterprise. He was convicted for tax fraud and on many occasions investigated for his sexual escapades. Berlusconi's story is both inspiring and shocking, and involves many references to people like Ghadaffi or even Vladimir Putin. But before all that wealth and drama, we need to go back to 1936 Italy, where a boy is born into a working-class family. Silvio's start in life was anything but extraordinary. He was born into a middle-class family from Milan. His father was a bank clerk and his mother a housewife. The Berlusconi family lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. In 1940, however, Italy's leader Mussolini partnered up with Adolf Hitler and declared war on Britain and France. Young Silvio was witness to a very dark time. Italy suffered, and many families, including the Berlusconis, had trouble putting enough food on the table. On top of that, the city of Milan was bombed by the Allies in 1943, and the Berlusconi family was forced to flee the city. Being an anti-fascist, Silvio's father Luigi fled to Switzerland on his own, leaving his wife Rosa and his 3 kids in a small countryside village. Being forced to evacuate his home and living under impoverished circumstances made an enormous impact on young Silvio. Being the oldest child, at 7 years of age, even Silvio had to pitch in to help the family. He worked on farms, picking potatoes for a few pennies, or milking cows to earn himself a bucket of yogurt. At nights, walking home from work, Silvio would see the city of Milan burning from the many Allied bombings. The war, his father's absence, and the struggle for food provided him with a strong survival instinct and a real sense of responsibility, something that would only help him in his later ventures. When the war ended, 11-year-old Silvio attended a Salesian college. These Christian schools are renowned for their strive towards discipline and hard work. Silvio attended for 8 years and claims that this time made him understand discipline, but also the value of being able to interact with everybody. While attending the school, he met his lifelong best friend, Fedele Confalonieri. The two got along really well from the get-go and were both very talented. While Fedele excelled as a musician, Silvio discovered a talent of his own. He began to specialize in making welcoming speeches for important guests who visited the school. He became the master of ceremonies and the official speech giver among students. From a young age, Silvio was known as a charismatic individual who used his strong voice to make an impact on crowds. Silvio's voice and Fedele's musical talent resulted in the 2 boys starting a 5-piece band in their last year of high school. They played together for a couple of years, performing in dance halls across the Milan area. However, Fedele and Silvio did not always get along. From the get-go, Silvio was always working the audience. He would talk to people in the crowd, dance with them, and build relationships with some. Silvio would call this pure marketing. Fedele, however, did not see it that way. And after many discussions, Fedele fired Silvio from the band. That's when Silvio decided it was time to continue on his own, and he got a job on a cruise ship. Starting as a bass player in a band, he eventually got his own solo act and established his name as a talented entertainer. He specialized in singing Italian and French love songs, but also included Frank Sinatra in his repertoire. His singing would take him from cruise ships all the way to Paris, where his career as entertainer ended after his father convinced him to finish law school. And so, at the age of 25, Silvio Berlusconi graduated from the University of Milan and made the leap from entertainer to entrepreneur, a leap that would determine the fate of Italy. The early 1960s were years of amazing growth and prosperity in post-war Italy. There was a new wave of industrialization and urbanization, and many Italians migrated from the rural south to the prosperous north. So this meant there were plenty of jobs and not enough housing in Milan. At the same time, a young Silvio Berlusconi had his mind set on becoming successful. He saw the supply gap on the housing market as a great opportunity and had spotted a promising plot of land, perfect for development. There was one problem, however. Berlusconi had just graduated and was basically dirt poor. What he did have, however, was the skill to sell himself and his ideas to anyone that he would meet. Through his father, he was introduced to a small-time builder, Pietro Canali. Silvio proposed a partnership to Canali, in which he would do all the development work and Canali would build the homes. And so the company United Builders of Milan was founded, and after negotiating a 500 million lire loan, Berlusconi was ready to become a real estate mogul. At this time, Berlusconi's other side kicked in. He was always a charmer and a sweet talker, but he was also a dedicated workaholic. From the beginning of his venture, he played the roles of entrepreneur, deal maker, architect, head of sales, and promoter. This may seem very chaotic, but it paid off. United Builders of Milan sold all of the 20 apartments located on the development site. And soon, Berlusconi started thinking bigger. Nonetheless, he started to dislike construction work in Milan. In those days, making the rounds was a mandatory task. In order to get the right permits, you had to pay off all the respective government officials, otherwise your project would be doomed from the start. So Berlusconi started operating around the Milan area under a new company named Edil Nord. And by operating outside of the city, he began to establish his name within the world of real estate. And after beating economic troubles in the mid-60s, Berlusconi was prospering. By the late 1960s, he became a father of his first 2 children with his then wife Carla. Business was booming too. Berlusconi had established his name as a real estate mogul by 1970 and had his mind set on some new ideas. He was the first in Italy to introduce the concept of satellite cities. These suburban towns were built for people to commute to cities like Milan and Rome and were catered to the most modern standards. For this, Berlusconi was awarded the title of knighthood, Cavaliere in Italian, which he carried with a lot of pride. The construction of his satellite city Milano Due made him a wealthy man, someone who enjoyed living the high life. However, this was not enough for Berlusconi. He wanted to do something new, explore new ventures, make new deals. But to his own surprise, this would lead him back to Milano Due. In 1974, a small Italian court allowed an obscure local television channel to continue broadcasting via cable, independent of government control. This ruling hit Italy like an earthquake, because up until that moment, only state television was allowed to be broadcasted. But this precedent changed things forever. Berlusconi followed the court ruling with a lot of intention. He saw challenging the government television monopoly as an enormous business opportunity. And so in 1978, he launched his own commercial TV channel, Tele Milano 58. Berlusconi's rivals from state-owned RAI, backed by the Christian Democrats, were not happy with his commercial takeover. They saw him as a huge threat that needed to be dealt with. So in 1984, they used their political influence to shut down all of Berlusconi's channels. With the help of a couple signatures, Channel 5, Rete 4 and Italia 1 were taken off air. This would later be seen as the start of a political war. Now, Berlusconi also had political influence. More specifically, the Italian Prime Minister Craxi was a personal friend of his. Berlusconi persuaded him into signing an emergency decree that overruled the decision made by the Christian Democrats. This first decree became known as the Berlusconi Decree and was seen as highly controversial, as the Prime Minister basically used his power and influence to help out a friend. In the end, it took 3 decades before Berlusconi's channels were finally off the hook. And after investigations, it was alleged that a $15 million bribe was paid to Craxi. Conveniently though, the statute of limitations just expired before the two of them could ever be convicted. Such a fortunate coincidence. Berlusconi's rise to fame and power gave him the opportunity to travel the world whenever he wanted to, and he even owned residencies in countries like Switzerland or France. However, Berlusconi had never forgotten where he came from. Being born and raised in the city of Milan, he was a true fan of football club AC Milan. As a boy, he would visit home games with his father, and as he got older, the love for his club did not fade away. So when he got the chance to become owner of the club, he didn't hesitate for too long. In early 1986, Silvio Berlusconi became the owner of football club AC Milan. Having bought the team, Berlusconi wanted to make a spectacular entrance into the world of football. Completely in his style, he took the movie Apocalypse Now as his inspiration. In a dramatic display, his newly signed players would arrive by helicopter for their presentation to the fans. At the same time, the stadium speakers would play a Ride of the Valkyries by Wagner, just like the famous movie scene. Players like Maldini, Massaro and Baresi were welcomed to the club, completely in the style of showman Berlusconi. However, it wasn't just show that Berlusconi brought to Milan. It was also loads of money and a vision. Berlusconi was of the opinion that AC Milan played a boring defensive game and should instead focus a lot more on the attack. So with the signings of coach Sacchi and players from Boston, Rijkaard and Gullit, Berlusconi shaped his team into an attacking machine. Star players and management in place, AC Milan began to rack up victories. They won the Italian League in '88 and the Champions League back-to-back in '89 and '90. These were Maldini, Gullit, Kaká, the list goes on and on. Berlusconi's style of management worked for a long time. He was always keen on installing young, impressionable managers who would listen to his tactical advice. Because, as with all his ventures, Berlusconi just wasn't the guy who would calmly sit on the sidelines. He would visit the club's training ground at least once a week to discuss the match lineup for the next game, or just to show the team who was really in control. In attendance of the players, he would school managers like a general would do to a foot soldier. On the other hand, he was very concerned with the well-being of his players. How are you settling in? Are your kids having a good time in school? What does your wife think about the city of Milan? His involvement with AC Milan will forever remain part of the club's history. And in spite of all the scandals and controversies, AC Milan fans still idolize him by calling him Il Presidente. Because for many Milanisti, Berlusconi will always be the boss. In the early 90s, Italy went through a phase of rigorous change. A special investigative unit was set up to clear Italian politics of the mass corruption that was happening. Operation Clean Hands swept through the system with force, and a lot of the established party members, entrepreneurs, and important figures were sanctioned or even thrown in prison. Even Italy's biggest companies like Fiat, Olivetti, and Berlusconi's own Fininvest were heavily searched for links to bribery payments. In the midst of this bureaucratic crisis, Berlusconi became increasingly anxious. See, in those days, the Italian Communist Party was very prominent and had a lot of power and influence in Italy. Since they were mainly funded by the Soviet Union and not by private funds, they were out of reach for Operation Clean Hands. So as all of Italy's political parties were burning, the Communist Party was only getting stronger. Berlusconi dreaded a communist victory and almost felt compelled to make sure that wouldn't happen. And so in the summer of 1993, Berlusconi decided to take action. That summer, he founded political party Forza Italia, which literally translates to Go Italy, and is used by Italian fans to cheer on the national football team. By the end of 1993, a number of Berlusconi's advertising and marketing men, alongside the network of financial consultants, opened local Forza Italia clubs up and down the country. This will become the backbone of the party that was designed for a particular target audience. It was all straight out of the Berlusconi playbook, and it marked the first time in Western history that a national political party had been designed, engineered, funded, and then launched from inside of a major corporation. Berlusconi analyzed the market, saw what was lacking, and created a product to fill the market gap. The Italian people were introduced to a whole new way of politics, the Berlusconi way. His campaign started only 60 days before election day, so Berlusconi was working under extreme pressure and only slept an average of 3 hours a night. And to everyone's surprise, his hard work paid off. On May 11th, 1994, Silvio Berlusconi was sworn in as Italian Prime Minister, becoming Europe's first billionaire head of state. This will be the beginning of a long career as a politician, with many ups and downs. And even though Berlusconi had secured 8 million Italian votes, his first spell in office did not last long. That same year, a string of corruption accusations against him were leaked to the press. Rumor had it Berlusconi would be convicted for bribery, and even though none of the claims held up in court, his coalition fell. After a total of 6 months, the world of politics had chewed him up and spit him out again. In 1996, he failed to win the elections again, but in 2001, he made an incredible political comeback. Following a slick campaign full of TV spots and celebrity endorsements, he regained the trust of the Italian people, who were already fed up with the left-wing coalition that had replaced Berlusconi a few years earlier. And so he became Italy's prime minister for the second time. Exactly 3 months into his second term as Italy's prime minister, something happened that would change the world forever. On September 11, 2001, terrorist group Al-Qaeda crashed 2 airplanes into the Twin Towers in New York, killing almost 3,000 people. The entire world now had its eyes fixed on America and President George Bush, who was bloodthirsty for revenge. Berlusconi found himself in a crucial position. In his first 3 months, he and Bush had gotten along really well. They had found each other as natural right-wing allies, agreeing on most political topics. Personally, the two had become friends, staying over at their private homes during state visits. The attacks, however, had made their relationship a lot more serious. In the months after 9/11, Bush had formed a genuine belief that starting a war with Iraq was the only correct response to the attacks. Berlusconi was really opposed to this idea and did everything he could to dissuade him from this plan. He talked to Libya's leader and personal friend Ghadaffi about taking Saddam Hussein in as an exile and almost convinced Bush of the foolishness of war. In the end, he failed. The US declared war on terror and invaded Iraq, killing thousands of people in the process. Ultimately, no nuclear weapons were found in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden had already fled the country. During his second term as Italy's prime minister, Berlusconi developed another friendship with a controversial leader, Vladimir Putin. Their friendship started in the midst of the crisis after 9/11. Both leaders were against American intervention in Iraq and met with each other on a regular basis to discuss politics. Putin and Berlusconi were anything but natural allies. One was a cold and seasoned KGB agent, the other a handsome entertainer. Yet, on a personal level, the two world leaders hit it off. Putin admired Berlusconi's personal diplomatic style and often visited his good friend in his private villa in Sardinia. Berlusconi's friendship with both Putin and Bush also resulted in political benefits. In an attempt to unite NATO and Russia, Berlusconi set up a summit in Rome, inviting the leaders of France, England, Russia, and America. In a dramatic, Berlusconi-like setting, Bush and Putin signed the Rome Summit Declaration. This marked the creation of the NATO-Russia Council and led to the most cooperative times between Russia and the West since the start of the Cold War. However, despite their efforts towards improved global relations, Putin and Berlusconi's friendship was also characterized by controversy. Reports came out about secret energy deals, and Italian newspapers were outraged by Berlusconi's support of Putin during his disputed invasions of Georgia and Crimea. They said their friendship wasn't real and that Putin only used Berlusconi to gain a foothold in Europe. Contrary to these statements, Putin has always spoken highly of his friend Silvio, who he claims was one of Europe's greatest politicians ever. Opposed to his political friendships, Berlusconi also had his bureaucratic adversaries. During his terms as Italian Prime Minister, Berlusconi had built up a friendship with Libyan dictator Ghadaffi. They had turned a very bad relationship between Italy and Libya into a cooperative exchange. In the years leading up to the 2010s, the two countries' leaders had forged deals on the colonial reparation payments from Italy, made several oil contracts, and had even made an effort to reduce the mass influx of migrants from the northern African shores. Berlusconi, in cooperation with other European leaders, had turned Ghadaffi from a mad dog dictator to a collegial partner. Yet, this partnership came to a sudden stop with the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2011. After the people of Tunisia and Egypt had gotten rid of their dictators, Libya was bound to be next. However, Ghadaffi, who had been Libya's leader for more than 40 years, was not going to play along with his nation's wishes. After a period of protests, a full-scale civil war broke out between the Libyan army and the civil militias. A number of European politicians, led by French President Sarkozy, were in favor of military action against Ghadaffi. Berlusconi was very much against this plan, as he didn't believe Libya would benefit from the removal of the dictator. Ultimately, a summit was held in France to decide on the fate of Ghadaffi. But when Berlusconi arrived, Sarkozy simply briefed the other leaders with the message that France's planes were already starting their engines, ready to engage Libya's army. Berlusconi was furious, and as Ghadaffi's troops were bombed, the relationship between him and Sarkozy was torn apart. Political relationships would prove to play a crucial role when the euro crisis reached its height in 2011. As Italy's economic situation worsened, so did Berlusconi's position as prime minister. Merkel, who was Chancellor of Germany, had grown to dislike Berlusconi after he had allegedly called her an unfuckable woman. She and Sarkozy made it clear in front of the cameras that they had no confidence in Italy's financial future with Berlusconi as its leader. This signal of distrust would eventually be enough for Berlusconi's rocky government to fall. And so his career as Prime Minister of Italy ended after 9 years and 3 separate terms in office. This makes him Italy's longest reigning politician after World War II. In total, Berlusconi has faced a number of 61 investigations, trials and indictments throughout his life. All in all, Berlusconi was convicted in a total of 7 trials, although only once in a definitive Supreme Court verdict. On 9 occasions he was declared not guilty, and 35 times charges were dropped. He is the world record holder among billionaires and prime ministers for indictments and has spent $700 million on lawyers in the process. Treating all of these cases with the same attention would take hours, so in this chapter we have compiled the most notorious ones. The case of the funds that went from Berlusconi's company Fininvest to Bettino Craxi, Italy's former prime minister, is part of a more complex set of accusations made against Berlusconi. The man who had helped Berlusconi funnel the money was a prominent London lawyer named David Mackenzie Mills. He was a corporate lawyer who specialized in work for Italian companies, and he was married to a minister in Tony Blair's government, Tessa Jowell. Mills was accused of receiving a $600,000 bribe from Berlusconi in order to perjure himself under oath and deny certain aspects of the network of offshore companies. At the same time, Berlusconi was also charged with bribing a witness. The lawyer's wife, Tessa Jowell, was an up-and-coming British politician. When in 2006 the scandal erupted, she separated from her husband and claimed that she knew nothing of the $600,000 payment, which she described as a gift from Berlusconi. The British press went into an overdrive, claiming that Jowell had only left her husband for the sake of appearances and political convenience. 6 years later, Mrs. Mills reunited with her husband after all of the Italian trial proceedings had come to a close. In early 2009, a Milan court found David Mills guilty and sentenced him to 4.5 years in jail for accepting a bribe from Berlusconi. Later in 2009, an appeals court upheld the Mills bribery conviction and he launched an appeal to the Supreme Court. The statute of limitations ran out early the following year, meaning that under Italian law, his guilty verdict was struck from the books. Jowell, who was hoping to run for mayor of London in 2016, then told the press that her husband had been exonerated by an Italian court. As for Berlusconi, who had been indicted alongside Mills, he was no longer a defendant. In 2008, while he was presiding over his 4th government, Parliament had passed a law that exempted the Prime Minister and 3 other high-ranking Italian government officials from being tried in court as long as the government was in office. A year later, the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional, but by early 2012, the statute of limitations kicked in for Berlusconi. So in fact, He had made a law that practically prevented him from going to jail. These were no uncommon occurrences. Throughout his various governments, 13 of these laws were introduced that seemed tailor-made to suit his personal legal issues. But Berlusconi's most defining trials came later. After he was forced to resign as Prime Minister in 2011, the Italian Justice Department pursued claims of alleged tax evasion that happened in his company Mediaset. Berlusconi denied all charges, but in the end he was convicted for the first time. His punishment was twofold. He was charged with 1 year community service, in which he was forced to work with elderly people with Alzheimer's disease. His other penalty, which he described as humiliating, was the stripping of his Cavaliere title, which he had obtained in 1977. He was also barred from the elections for 2 years and was therefore forced to temporarily step down as Forza Italia's candidate. His conviction also coincided with his most notorious legal proceeding, the one that forever changed his legacy and the way that he would be remembered: the infamous Bunga Bunga trial. On May 27, 2010, Karima El Maghrouk, better known as Ruby the Heart Stealer, was arrested by the police in Milan on suspicion of stealing $3,000. After a couple of hours, while she was being questioned, Berlusconi called the head of police in Milan and pressured for her release, claiming the girl was the niece of then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and that in order to avoid a diplomatic crisis, she was to be released immediately. And after repeated phone calls from Berlusconi, she was finally set free from prison. Karima El Maghrouk was an underage nightclub dancer at the time of her arrest, and when the phone calls were leaked to the press, Italy exploded. A full-scale investigation started into the relationship between Berlusconi and El Maghrouk, and the Italian press had a fair share of enjoyment diving into Berlusconi's private life. She was rumored to be part of his infamous Bunga Bunga parties, or as he would call it, informal dinner parties. These alleged sex parties were said to be filled with prostitutes and were hosted at Arcore, Berlusconi's villa. The investigation led to him being charged with paying for underage sex with a minor, a really serious offense. Contrary to these allegations, Ruby always said that the two never had sex and that their relationship was never sexual in nature. Berlusconi has always confirmed this and also said that he assumed she was older than 18 because she was a nightclub dancer. After years and years of legal battle, an appeals court ruled in favor of Berlusconi and all charges against him were dropped. It was never proven that the two had ever had sex. Nonetheless, for many people, Berlusconi was guilty. His name and image was dragged through the mud, and his persona would forever be tied to the words Bunga Bunga. Berlusconi's influence over Italy and over generations of young Italians who grew up knowing only him would be hard to overstate. No other political leader has so completely dominated the country for such a long period, shaping and reshaping the nation in political, cultural and social terms. In many ways, Berlusconi embodies the Italian identity. His distinguished salesmanship, his dramatic persona and his charming abilities all included. His political success owes much to him being the personification of the Italian dream, an ideal image for many Italians. Berlusconi managed to become both the most hated and the most beloved man in Italy over a period of 2 decades. For a long time, it was possible to live in a world created just by him. Being an AC Milan fan who worked in one of his companies, lived in one of his houses, watched one of his television channels and voted Forza Italia, your whole world will be determined by the actions of one man. From his rise as an entertainer to his real estate ventures, his construction of a media empire and his 20 years in Italian politics, Silvio Berlusconi's journey has been an impressive one. His journey began in fall of 1936 and ended recently, as he passed away on the 12th of June 2023 at 86 years of age, leaving behind 5 children, 2 ex-wives and his 33-year-old girlfriend. Undeniably, Berlusconi's death leaves behind an incredible void, but his imprint on Italy and the rest of the world will remain forever.